TopMedTalk.
Welcome to TopMedTalk, where we're getting ready for the 18th World Congress of Anaesthesiologists. The WCA 2024 is taking place in Singapore from the 3rd of March through till the 7th. And it will be the first WCA Congress to be held in person since 2016. And TopMedTalk will be there live. We'll be bringing you all the information we can from the conference itself. Coming up in this podcast, our focus on obstetrics, AI in perioperative care, Guy Ludbrook's post-operative work, Denny Levitt, and also Kate Leslie. Firstly, here on TopMedTalk, we're having a look at obstetrics, and we begin with some words from Carolyn Johnston, consultant anaesthetist in St George's Hospital in London and improvement lead for the National Emergency Laparotomy Network.
Maternity is the real perioperative medicine specialty. So obstetric anaesthetists and obstetricians deal with perioperative medicine all the time. And this is a photograph of our board in the middle of last week when I was thinking about what I was going to write on this presentation. And there's a few things there I think it'd be quite helpful just to highlight. This is our patients with maternal or social comorbidities. So we have a lady here who's got lymphoma. We've got another lady who's got two ladies with sickle cell disease. We've got TB. We've got pancreatitis. And of course, we've got type 2 diabetes and we've got obesity. So that is a big part of our workload on the labour ward, is actually dealing with these women that have other comorbidities in their lives that are going to influence their delivery. And it's worth noting at this point that the Embrace report now shows that 2/3 of our deaths are attributable to things not unique to the labour period. It's attributable to other maternal physical health or maternal mental health. We have some women that we're dealing with the impact of previous pregnancies, and that may be the physical impact, so scars, morbidly adherent placentas, and more often now, psychological impacts of what's gone on in previous pregnancies. So a very difficult delivery makes it very difficult for a woman to come in subsequently and have her second baby. So that is an increasing part of our workload. Sepsis is a big thing for us, as I guess it is everywhere in the hospital. Not too many with sepsis there that day. I think we were quite lucky. And another big part of our care is the multidisciplinary nature of looking after two patients. Now, of course, the mother has primacy in law and is our first concern, but we're delivering quite a lot of complex babies, really. And there's a huge amount of collaboration and cooperation that needs to go on to make that happen.
If you like the sound of that, check out the show notes to this podcast where you'll find links to the full presentation. That's true of all the clips we're going to listen to today. Enhanced recovery after surgery for obstetrics is a topic that we've touched on back in the early days of TopMedTalk. Here's Dr. Attila Kett, anaesthesiologist and chairman at St Peter's University Hospital at New Jersey, talking about how he set up an ERAS, Enhanced Recovery After Surgery, obstetrics service at his practice.
St. Peter's is a very unique institution. We are one of the largest perinatal centers in the Northeast. So our experience, we started with obstetrics. We deliver over 6,000 babies. And we were the first in the country to develop an ERAS program for obstetrics. So this is a very unique scenario. You know, you guys dealing with how to connect primary care providers with specialists. This is a scenario where the obstetrician is the primary care provider and the surgeon at the same place. So that kind of made our job a little bit easier. But we had the challenges that there was no templates to follow, at least in this country. So I reached back and I'm originally from Europe, but I reached to England, where we see a lot of people from here, and we connected with Dr. Ian Wrench from Sheffield, who literally guided us through implementing this program.
The full conversation is, of course, available in the show notes. As you can appreciate, this is a huge topic, but recently it's been thrown into the limelight as people started to notice something troubling about mortality rates. Listen here to Alexander J Butwick, obstetric anaesthesiologist and researcher in maternal hemorrhage, pain relief in labour and obstetric epidemiology at Stanford University.
So you've been listening to TopMedTalk?
Yes, that's correct.
For a while,
Love the talks. Fantastic stuff. Always gets me very excited about the world of perioperative medicine.
Yeah.
Some of which overlaps with obstetric anesthesia, which I'm guessing you guys want to chat about.
You called us out on that. You said, don't want to load the bases here, guys, but I'm not sure you're doing enough on obstetrics, which is a good shout. Now we've done more.
Yeah, so my main area of research interest is to do with postpartum hemorrhage. So the work that we've done at Stanford has been predominantly involved in identifying approaches and strategies to better prevent, but probably more importantly, the clinical management of postpartum hemorrhage when it occurs on the labor and delivery unit, and also complications that are associated with postpartum hemorrhage as well. You've probably seen in the press, it's very topical right now, the fact that the US, unfortunately and depressingly, has the highest maternal mortality rate compared to other developed countries.
Gosh, that's
Scary.
hard to get your head around, isn't it?
It is astonishing. Yeah, it really is.
We touched on this a little bit with our last discussion about how systems develop and the challenge of the geography and the socioeconomic diversity in the USA. But what do you think? Why?
How long do we have to answer that question?
Oh, I know.
What about the 5-minute version?
Yeah, the elevator.
So I think there's various reasons why. There's issues from a system standpoint, which is probably one of the main reasons why. There's obviously issues from a hospital level standpoint, provider level, and then there's differences according to the patient populations that you serve as well. So if you factor all of those in, they probably in combination are major contributors towards the fact that we should be doing a lot better than we are.
Now, I've been to Stanford, to Palo Alto, and it looked real fancy to me.
I keep saying so.
Well, in the same way that where I work looks real fancy, but it's got in between the little pockets, in between the fancy bits, there are very deprived populations.
Yes, that's
Is it
right.
those deprived populations where it's happening, or is it broader than that?
As you probably read in the press, there are disparities that we see in terms of the rates of maternal mortality and also morbidity. So it's not just in terms of the deaths that we see, the rates of morbidity amongst women that survive are substantially higher if you come from a minority group.
Yeah.
And in particular, if you're African American. Right. Now, the challenge is trying to figure out the why. And the concern is it's not necessarily to do with the background of the patient. It may be more to do with how they're treated at the hospital and the community level. So we're talking about racism as much, if not more so, than the backgrounds that the patients have based upon their race and ethnicity.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty sad.
Actually
right?
really scary.
It's
reality.
It's a very common discussion point we have on TopMedTalk. We're quite a transatlantic setup.
Right.
So we do a lot of reflection comparing Europe, but in particular the English National Health Service, to the state of play in the United States of America.
Yeah.
And the conclusion we seem to commonly reach is you can buy the best healthcare in the world in the United States of America, but on average, it just ain't that good.
Yeah, and it's a real shame, and I think there's lots of opportunities to do better, as you can probably guess.
Also, as we look forward to the WCA, we expect more discussion about the fast-moving hot topic of artificial intelligence. It's something we've been discussing in detail here on TopMedTalk, and this next clip is a sober reminder of why AI could be a problem for us humans. Adrian Chapman, Professor at the University of Southampton, Head of Digital Health Research Group, Director for the Centre of Health Technologies, explains a potential pitfall.
It's a really complex question. I'm going to actually start with a story if I have just a little bit of time.
Cool.
It's a beautiful story about automation bias. So Professor Howard at Georgia Tech sat down and brought in a bunch of people to a room to do a study. And they were met at the door with a little robot that says this way and comes to the waiting room. And while they're filling out their form for consent, the smoke alarm goes off. And they're met at the waiting room door with the exit door right here. And the little robot's there waving a little flag. And they follow the robot, statistically at a very high percentage, away from the exit door. She pushed it further. They will follow the robot away from the exit door into a dark room. They will follow the robot away from the exit door into a dark room that has furniture piled up in front of it where they have to duck down and crawl in. And they will do that even if there's smoke in the room. Right, so humans, we have this automation bias. The computer said so, it knows what's right. What Mike's asking, though, is a slightly more complex question because we are the creators of much of this data in the first place. And I mean, as far as the Edwards example is perfect, that MAP is actually the data you have, but it's actually not the right data. And so there's this problem, this tension right now of, well, what data do we actually have? We were the creators of it. We already have our biases in this. And how do you decouple it? And we're nowhere near that answer right now, sadly. So I think we have to be there with common sense and a little better training about things like automation bias so that we don't walk into a dark and smoke-filled room when the exit door is right there.
That's taken from the potential of artificial intelligence in perioperative care Q&A from the EBPOM World Congress. It was recently posted onto TopMedTalk and the fuller conversation is available in the show notes. So, should we be concerned about the AI revolution? Sandy Alexander Jackson, specialty trainee in anaesthetics and intensive care medicine and an NIHR doctoral fellow at the University of Southampton, told us this.
So this is what I think of when I think of a revolution. This is where you overthrow what came before, you reject what happened previously, and you replace it with something entirely new. And in the case of the French Revolution, you chop off the heads of everyone that was in charge of the previous system. So for those of you in this room, you might be a little bit worried if the revolution is really coming. But I'm going to argue that it's not a revolution. It's evolution, okay? Because revolution is rejecting what came before and replacing it with something entirely new. Whereas the correct application of artificial intelligence in healthcare is evolutionary. It builds on what we have learned before, and it takes things that step further with an aim of improving things. And actually, just like evolution, there'll be a process of natural selection. Some of these ideas will be good, and they will survive and thrive. Some of these ideas might not be quite so good, and will hopefully quietly die away. Okay? Now, Age has done a great job of summarizing pretty much all you need to know about sort of the AI to start with, but the way I simplify it for my very simple mind is that machine learning and artificial intelligence is excellent at spotting patterns. And those patterns can be really complicated, and medicine's full of patterns. If you can spot a pattern, you can try and make a prediction. And it's that power of prediction that is useful for us in healthcare.
That's taken from Artificial Intelligence in Perioperative Care. You'll find a link to that podcast in the show notes. Also, as we report on the WCA, expect a focus upon Guy Ludbrook's post-operative work. Here's a presentation he did on it for Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine, EBPOM.
So we decided to look at a different way of approaching recovery in something we call advanced recovery room care. And we took moderate risk patients, the same ones we saw at Torbay, and we kept them in the recovery room until the morning of day one. But we included very specifically structured activities, and I think I'll explain that a little bit better later on. So what were the highly structured activities? They involved very careful and accurate risk assessment and triage, a multidisciplinary approach, assessment and management by the clock, a checklist of progress, a 19-point checklist against physiological goals. If the patient wasn't within range, what were you going to do about it? Write it down and review it an hour later. And lastly, handover was effective, not only to the colleague that may be looking after the patient in recovery, but the following morning. So what we'd learnt during the night could be passed on to the residents who'd be looking after the patient the next day. So this was an exploratory study, and we looked at a whole lot of things. Firstly, the main objective was it feasible? And it did prove to be so. And we saw some signals that were interesting. So ICU rescue appeared to be less, very small numbers, of course. Return to theatre appeared to be less, very small numbers, of course. The thing that was most impressive was readmissions at 90 days. And here's that number again, 34%. Granted, this is out to 90 days rather than 30, but it's not a flattering figure. When we looked at the patients in a before and after study that were readmitted, afterwards readmission rates dropped, but readmission duration also dropped, quite dramatically in fact. So overall, readmission beds days dropped by 80%. That's days at home, an average of 3 per patient. That's a return on investment of $2.50 for every one, a figure I don't believe. It'll be at least twice that. and we could add 4,000 bed days a year to our hospital, I'm sure we could find something useful to do with those.
We're expecting to catch up with Denny Levitt when we're at the conference. Denny Levitt, of course, Professor in Perioperative Medicine and Critical Care at the University of Southampton and a consultant in Perioperative Medicine at Southampton University Hospital NHS Foundation Trust, is a popular name here on TopMedTalk. Have a listen to her speaking about the pandemic she's been most concerned about.
I want to talk a little bit, we might be a bit bored of pandemics, but I personally think this is a worse pandemic than the one we've just had, and its impact, if we don't do something about it, is going to be even more far-reaching than COVID has been. This is about the global inactivity pandemic. So every time we've done activity surveying globally in the Western world in the last 50 years, every single time we measure it, physical inactivity levels get higher. In 2012, the World Health Organization announced a campaign to reduce physical inactivity by 10% as one of public health's best buys, because its lack of physical activity, physical sedentariness, is estimated to be a direct cause of about 5 million deaths globally. That was back in 2012. So since we had this campaign, what happened when we measured it again in 2018? Well, global levels of inactivity increased from 23% to 28%. And if you happen to live in the developed world, that actually covers the fact that in the developed nations, it's 43%. And if you're a woman, this is rather alarming, because just now that was men. And as you can see, the women are darker, which means more inactive. And on average, we're about 8% less active than our male counterparts, which is pretty shocking. Now, that's all based on survey data, and you might say we're not very accurate about surveying, although in my experience, patients tend to underestimate what they actually do. But when this has been measured objectively, this is one of many studies published at the end of last year using accelerometry, it's really, really shocking. So less than 5% of awake time doing moderate activity, high intensity activity, less than 0.1% of the time. So this was middle-aged adults, 30,000 of them in Scandinavia, who on the whole are quite an active population. Even more worryingly, when you look at the projections currently, unless we do something, sedentariness is only going to increase because we've reduced the amount of activity that we have occupationally, and unfortunately the advent of screens and time on the internet and less time outdoors means that this will be increasing by another 10 to 15% by 2030 unless we do something.
If you want a link to the fuller presentation, please check out the show notes, topmedtalk.com. Or you can check us out on social media, where you'll also find notes to this podcast. Before we wrap up, let's have a little listen to Kate Leslie, who we also intend to catch up with at the WCA. If you're not aware of who Kate Leslie is, here's a quick refresher, taken from a podcast called Diversity and Gender Balance in Research. Kate Leslie, Honorary Professor, Monash University, Melbourne, Australia, Specialist Anaesthetist at the Royal Melbourne Hospital and Northwestern Mental Health, and Non-Executive Director of the Australian Medical Council. Here's what she had to say.
I've continued my interest with multi-centre trials along with my colleagues in the ANSCA CTN, and most thrillingly we have just received $3 million to do a multi-centre trial on sugammadex, neostigmine and post-operative pulmonary complications. So that's very exciting. That's got an embedded health economic analysis. I'll be running that with colleagues from the University of Melbourne and the ANSCA CTN. So that's a big thrill. But at this conference, it's great. I mean, it's a testament to persistence, endurance and resilience, which many of my clinical trial colleagues around the world will recognise are essential characteristics if you ever want to complete a large multi-centre trial.
Absolutely.
So you forget about all the inspiration and vision that you might once have had as you get ground down by the system. But anyway, on a more positive note, at this meeting I'm talking about some research that we did about the participation of women in clinical trials. And this really came off a symposium that the British Journal of Anaesthesia ran in Prato, Italy, a few years ago, where they got together a whole host of women from around the world to talk about the involvement of women as researchers, but also the involvement of women as patients. And at that time, we recognised, I think we knew it all along, that there was room for improvement in both of those things, and it sort of coincides with the whole Me Too kind of movement as well. So Jessica Kaiser, who's a biostatistician in Melbourne, and we looked at ANZCA clinical trial network trials, and we did an analysis about the participation of women. And what we showed was that none of our trials included more than 50% women, and then on average it was about 35 or 40% of the participants were women. And we also showed that women were at lower risk than men. The women who were recruited to the trials were at lower risk. But interestingly, they had the same outcomes. So they were just as likely to die, have myocardial infarction, stroke, or surgical site infection. So it made us wonder about whether there are the reasons for that, whether women have some hidden risk factors that we're not measuring and that they're actually at higher risk than they appear to be, or whether they're receiving different care from men, whether they are actually having more of the outcomes, or whether men are getting more of the investigations that lead to the diagnosis of the outcomes.
Once again, the fuller conversation is available. All you need to do is check out the show notes to this podcast. We look forward to seeing you at the WCA. We'll be there in Singapore from the 3rd through to the 7th of March. Check out social media for more information, and we look forward to you hearing us there then.
TopMedTalk.
Thanks for downloading TopMedTalk. Don't forget to subscribe via your podcatcher. Don't forget to check us out on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And also, don't forget, TopMedTalk is the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine. We'd love you to find out more about that. If you check out ebpom.org, you can find low prices on some of the conferences we're organising around the world. Many of them are virtual and don't even involve you leaving your own home. Check out ebpom.org now.